today for today's Samvad session. I am going to host you all for the 18th episode of Samvad series. First, let me begin with giving a brief intro about what Samvad really is. So, Samvad is an online student-led monthly lecture series at the South Asian University that brings together young minds into one single forum. It is a budding house of free-flowing ideas. The word Samvad, as we already know in Hindi, signifies dialogue and discussion, which is an age-old Indic way of learning and exploring through dialogue and dialectics. As a part of this lecture series, we plan to discuss Indian cultural history, diversity, and its civilizational identity, which are usually left out in the current and contemporary academic discourses. J Sai Deepak Ji is an engineer turned litigator practicing as an arguing counsel primarily before the Honorable mechanical engineer from Anna University. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur's Law School in 2009 and has carved a niche for himself as a litigator in civil, commercial, and constitutional matters. Over the years, he has been part of several landmark matters, such as the ones relating to Sabrimala Ayyappa Temple, the Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple, and the Basmati Geographical Indications matter. In 2009, he was awarded as the Young Alumni Achievers Award by his alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. Apart from delivering lectures on constitutional issues, he is a prolific writer for leading newspapers and magazines. We welcome Deepak Sai Ji, and I warmly welcome him, and I request him to share his thoughts on his current book, which is for discussion today. He will give his short comments and will be followed by a discussion with the students' question. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Rahul Ji. I'm happy to be a part of Samvad and to actually share space with your students. And I've heard a lot of reviews about the South Asian University, and I've always wanted to interact with the students. In fact, one of your students reached out several months ago. It's just that I was in the midst of finishing the book, and which is why I had put it off for a while. So I'm happy that I'm finally getting an opportunity to interact with the students of your university. I'll keep my comments very short and crisp because I've already said a lot about what the book is in other places. So as opposed to sounding repetitive, let me try and see if I can make it relevant to the students of South Asian University and the participants here. So one of the things that the book touches upon significantly and which I think would be of serious interest to students of international law is the origins of international law and, let's say, civilizational standards, which have then morphed into legal standards, such as the standard of civilization, so to speak. That's an issue I significantly touch upon in chapter 4 and subsequently in the final chapter, chapter 11. So the book is about 11 chapters. And as the subtitle of the book captures, the structure of the book is split into 3 sections. The first section is called Coloniality. The second section is called Civilization. And the third section is called Constitution. The first section has 5 chapters. The second section has 4 chapters. And the third section has 2 chapters. I have deliberately kept the Constitution section of the book minimal in this particular case because this book is book 1 of what I call the Bharat trilogy. Establishes or lays the conceptual foundations or the theoretical framework in the backdrop of which I will examine the origins and the framing of Bharat's contemporary constitution and ask myself whether there are several degrees of separation between Bharat's civilizational consciousness and its constitutional consciousness. That's the basic theme and the basic, let's say, task that I have cut out for myself as part of this particular trilogy. The broad period that the entire trilogy will cover is at least from 1492 to at least 1992 at the very least. And in this book, which is book 1, I have covered the period between 1492 to 1920. What is the significance of this particular time window? Let me try and capture it in as crisp a manner as possible. 1492 is typically associated with the Columbian expedition, when Christopher Columbus set out to explore what was known as the New World. And New World effectively translates to non-European, non-Christian world. And to most people who understand history, New World was the exploration of pagan lands by Christopher Columbus. So from there is where typically colonization as a project is traced. And while, let's say, the post-colonial school in Bharat typically associates the colonial period between the 17th and 18th century and the middle of the 20th century, the decolonial school, which happens to be the foundation of this particular book, traces the origins of colonization right up to Columbus's expedition of 1492. And what kind of, let's say, reshaping of the rest of the world, including Europe, transpired as a consequence of this colonial project or this colonization project? And what was the mentality that effectively drove this project, the psychology of it, the logic of it, the consciousness of it, its religious origins, its racial origins? These are issues that I've significantly covered in the first section. So the reason why the book ends at 1919, 1920, it's not a conscious decision that I took at the outset. This book was supposed to be a single book, but it just so happens that I stumbled upon such mountain of fantastic literature and research material that I wanted to do justice to each of that and cover as many aspects as possible to try and present a very comprehensive picture. And therefore, when I was perhaps at 60% of the book, I decided to break this up into a trilogy. And I decided that in order for me to do justice to everything that has been pulled out and everything that is available and which most people don't discuss in public domain, it would be in the interest of the subject to break this up into a trilogy. Therefore, the trilogy as a decision was actually taken sometime around January, February. That is about 2 months or 3 months before I completed the book. And 1919, 1920 happens to be the outer limit as far as book one is concerned, because that is the period where several international milestones and national milestones come together. First of all, that marks the period of, let's say, the conclusion of the Great War. The First World War was the name given to the Great War after the Second World War, but until then it was called the Great War. So, therefore, the peace conference leading up to the founding of League of Nations and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, so to speak, these three developments are significantly touched upon for the clear reason that they had a bearing not just on the founding of the League of Nations, but also on formation of nation states and reshaping of several colonized territories as nation states, with one of the necessary ingredients being bestowing upon them this document called the Constitution. So if at all there is one international milestone that can be credited with mainstreaming the concept of the Constitution itself, it must be the League of Nations, the standard of civilization, both of them coming together to give rise to what we understand as contemporary constitutionalism as one of the hallmarks of what is a civilized state or a civilized nation state. So I treat that as the outer limit, because this marked the 1919 was effectively the year the first British-made constitution for Bharat came into existence, which is the Government of India Act of 1919. And therefore, the relationship between all these international developments and the formulation and the enactment of this first British-made constitution for Bharat, and what was the intention behind it, whether it was purely a secular decision as we understand it, whether this was purely an administrative decision, or was there a very specific politico-theological thought which drove this particular exercise, is something that I cover. And I believe I have covered significant ground citing scholarly material and primary sources, which includes debates from the British Parliament around that period, excerpts from the speeches of leaders who were the founding leaders of the League of Nations, then extracts from the conference proceedings, then provisions from the Government of India Act of 1919, as well as from the League of Nations Covenant. So these are aspects that I've covered significantly. So this happens to be the times, let's say, window which this particular book covers, that is 1492 to 1919, 1920. The second book, which hopefully should come out around the same period, which is around, let's say, August next year, July, August next year, shall cover the period between 1920 and 1951. because two major milestones, in fact, three major milestones populate this particular space. One is obviously the movement towards the Government of India Act of 1935, which significantly takes the character of the 1919 Act itself. Then the current constitution, the framing of the current constitution is covered in that particular period. And also 1951 marks the first amendment of the constitution, where two things happened, where land reform legislations were put in the 9th schedule. And in addition to that, you also had the Article 19, let's say, being amended significantly to enlarge the scope of restrictions on free speech under 19.2. So that's why 1920 to 1951 is the period that will be covered by the second book. The third book will cover the period between 1952 to 1992, but at the very least until 1977. 1952, because that's the year we had our first general elections. And from then on, what is the treatment of the constitution by the state is something that I hope to discuss, apart from the treatment of the constitution by the judiciary itself. But most importantly, this won't be a purely constitutional exercise. This is not meant to be, let's say, just a simple analysis of the evolution of the constitution, but primarily I'm looking at the evolution of the relationship between the constitution and the civilization. I'm just getting an emergency call. Just give me 10 seconds, please. Just 10 seconds. My apologies to the organizers and the listeners. It was an emergency call. So therefore, the idea is to try and understand whether colonial consciousness has had an impact on civilizational consciousness, and whether colonial consciousness has also had an impact on our constitutionalism. And therefore, is there a schismatic relationship or a troubled relationship between the Indic civilizational consciousness and the constitution per se, in the backdrop of daily arguments that we get to hear both in public discourse as well as in judicial discourse, which shows that the relationship between the constitution and the civilization is significantly animated by some kind of tension. So is this tension traceable to the constitution itself, or is this tension to be traced to the conduct of the state and the judiciary, which is independent of the constitution? These are aspects that I hope to actually address. And I'm sure it's possible for quite a few people to assume that I have a predetermined outcome towards which this entire exercise is geared or oriented towards. I don't have a predetermined outcome because I'm still reading and I still haven't made up my mind. In fact, even in this first book, I'm very, very clear about my conclusion, where I clearly say that at best, as on date, I'm in a position to say that until 1919, there seemed to be a clear existence of a colonial mindset, even in the framing of the constitution. But I have not made too much of comments with respect to the current constitution of 1950, because that will be dealt with in the second book. So the idea is to try and understand whether the constitution is a civilizational document, or is it a strictly secular document, which is perhaps the product of European constitutionalism and specifically French constitutionalism. These are aspects that I hope to cover in the second book. And or is it a mixed bag where you have both civilizational consciousness and colonial consciousness coexisting side by side, which more or less represents the state of the current society, where it is a hybrid product of its roots as well as what we know as European modernity, so on and so forth. So these are aspects that I hope to cover in some significant detail. The one thing that I certainly want to explain, or let's say clarify, is that I'm not trying to look at issues of nuts and bolts, such as state list, central list, federation, or let's say the federal structure. This is not the realm which I'm actually exploring. I'm primarily asking myself whether the spirit which informs these infrastructures set up by the constitution is a native spirit, or is it a colonial spirit? This is a meta question of sorts. This is a soft question and a soft inquiry, not a hard inquiry, because obviously the institutions that we have inherited are clearly the legacy of the European. But whether the impulses that animate this particular infrastructure is European in nature, or is it Indian or Bharatiya in nature, is the question that I would like to address. And since this particular issue, to the best of my limited understanding and knowledge, has not been undertaken in a rigorous fashion in all the years of our constitutional scholarship, I believe that this particular book, whether it is good or bad, or whether it is useful or not, is certainly different. I don't know what to make of it in terms of, let's say, whether it has utility or not. That is for people to decide. But at the end of the day, I'm very, very confident of one thing, that this kind of discussion has not been undertaken previously. And to the best of my understanding, no other book in the market has actually undertaken this exercise, at least with respect to in the Indian Constitution. Typically, our scholarship has revolved around transformative constitutionalism, or let's say the basic structure doctrine, fundamental rights, tensions between the state organs, so to speak, between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. But I'm going several steps behind and further to basically ask whether this entire edifice, so to speak, is native in its thought, or is it alien in its thought? That is the central question that I'm trying to address. So let us see whether I've done it with some degree of success or not. I'll leave it to the readers to judge that. So I'll take questions now. I'm happy to take as many questions as possible. So please proceed to ask. And one request to the moderator, Rahul Ji, is that even if there are uncomfortable questions, so long as they are not personal, I'm happy to address them, because I don't want this to come across as some kind of a scripted conversation. So I'm more than happy to answer even the most uncomfortable of questions.
Many thanks, sir, for the brief introduction. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for the brief introduction. Now, the first question comes to my mind is the Eurocentric origin of the nation state.
Right.
And how do you conceive that Eurocentric notion with our notion of a nation state, which is given by the Indian scholars?
Right.
So first question is that, then we'll proceed to the questions from audience.
Okay. So it's interesting that you asked me this question, because what I've done is that in the first section, where I deal with the entrenchment of European political structures in colonized societies, one of the questions that I significantly touch upon is the origin of the current notion of a nation state. And I trace it back to the Treaty of Westphalia, and I significantly explain how Westphalia itself had a very clear religious origin because of the Protestant Reformation movement and the need to secure religious independence within the Christian world, so that principalities and feudalities and princely states, so to speak, could have the freedom to pursue their own Christian denominations, whether it's Lutheran, Calvinist, or Roman Catholic. So from there, how the concept of nation state has emerged and how it was universalized by the colonizer in several parts of the world is something that I significantly touch upon in the book. So the one thing that I'm very, very clear about is that, independent of what Indic philosophy says with respect to the concept of a state or the role of a state, what we think of and what we know of a nation state today is significantly Eurocentric in nature, and it is Western normative in nature. And the first challenge in our living times, so to speak, which has come to the concept of a nation state, has come from China, which has made it very, very difficult for, let's say, the European mind to wrap its head around the Chinese model of a nation state. The other two countries which are being spoken of as nation states apart from China, of course, India is certainly one country that they speak of, but the other surprising entry to this particular club is actually Turkey, which is being significantly discussed as the next civilizational state. But since 2014, I think it was Dr. Konrad Elst on his blog who first mentioned that since a case is being made for China as a civilizational state, maybe Bharat should also make its case as a civilizational state, because nation state does not do justice to the scale and diversity of this country. And it cannot be treated as a European nation. In fact, it can be compared with Europe as a continent, but not a European nation itself. Okay. Therefore, its comparable benchmark is European civilization, not any particular European country. Okay, that's one of the things that he said in terms of sheer scale and diversity, not with respect to similarities in culture, of course. So on this particular issue, ever since Dr. Konrad Elst made this particular proposition, several people have latched on to this to basically make the case that Bharat is a civilizational state, Bharat is a civilizational state. I don't believe that terms such as civilizational state must be used so loosely. Okay, it requires very clear, rigorous analysis to establish what you believe is a civilization state and why do you think Bharat satisfies those ingredients or those requirements. That is something that I don't think we have undertaken so far. And I actually hope to undertake that in this particular book, because a few of the recent publications simply declare as some kind of an axiomatic position that Bharat is a civilization state, to which I have very clearly addressed in the book that you must be able to strike a distinction between the state and the society. Bharat may be a civilization at the realm of a society, but that does not make Bharat a civilization state, because a civilization state is consciously aware of its civilizational character, and that civilizational character also influences its policy making. It also influences its, let's say, ideation when it comes to law and public discourse and morality, so on and so forth. To the best of my understanding, I said, the Indian state as it exists today certainly doesn't behave like a civilization state. Okay. And whether it believes it's a civilization state or not is a question that cannot be answered unless you test it on the touchstone of the constitution. Because the state cannot make any declaration which is independent of the constitution when this is a document on the basis of which you hold forth as a political unit. Okay. So therefore, I decided to undertake a fairly rigorous analysis, and that analysis is only 1/3 complete at this stage. So if you ask me whether we are a nation state or a civilization state today, I would say I still don't know. But if you ask me at the level of the society, are we a civilization? I think the answer is fairly obvious. Of course, we are a civilization in that particular regard. So there are about 7 to 8 specific policy prescriptions of a civilization state that I identify as part of, let's say, section 2, which deals with civilization. In the book, I've specifically captured it, where citing, let's say, the works of scholars of the mid-20th century and early 20th century, such as Radhakumar Mukherjee, R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar, and others, who were trying to make a case around that time that Bharat deserves to be an independent state because it has its own identity, it has its own character. They had to make this case because the British man was basically telling them that unless and until you're a nation, you can't lay claim for a nation statehood. Okay. And you're not a nation by the European definition was the argument that was being presented. So we were being denied our opportunity to, let's say, govern ourselves, even within the British Empire, as, let's say, under the Home Rule movement, primarily on the ground that you guys are not one as a society, therefore you can't be one as a state. In response to this, fantastic scholarship was generated around that period to basically say, first of all, please don't apply the European benchmark of a nation to us. We are a civilization, and therefore you cannot deprive us of our right to statehood on the anvils of nation statehood because we are effectively a civilization statehood. That's the argument that they had already generated then. So it's not a new argument that somebody has invented in the 2000s. This argument was presented even then. So when they were making these arguments, at least in 2 seminal works, Sri Radhakumar Mukherjee, I think in the Fundamental Theory of Hindu Culture, and there is another book, where he specifically spells out what must be the character of a future Indian state once it achieves independence and once it is a decolonized society, so to speak. And those prescriptions, I would say, are not just intuitively brilliant, but it also shows that he understood the confluence between civilization and political science, okay, between civilizational studies and political science. So I have extracted significant portion of his observations from his own works, and I have distilled my own conclusions and observations based on that to ask myself whether Bharat today satisfies these requirements to be able to call itself as a civilization state. So I've said that some of these serious terms should not be used as buzzwords merely for the purposes of, let's say, brownie points or because you want to catch the public attention. There is a lot more research that needs to go into this particular issue. So to answer your question, as we understand nation state today, it is clearly Eurocentric. It is 100% Western normative. And the requirements from the convention, the Montevideo Convention, or for that matter, any international, let's say, instrument, so to speak, clearly draw from the basic foundational requirements which are captured in the Treaty of Westphalia, which is to say that you need to have a clear identified territory and you must have, let's say, a culture which is common because of religion or language or race. These are aspects that they identify. And that particular idea was exported in every society which was colonized by the European to say that what is good for Europe is good for the rest of the world. Therefore, what is good for nation statehood for Europe is good for the rest of the world as well. That is why we have the contemporary notions of nation statehood in our minds, which are very close to European thought. I don't think anybody has actually undertaken any analysis of whether Bharat is a nation statehood on the basis of its own philosophy. So in this regard, there are some fantastic works. I think of, again, the 1900s only. K.P. Jaiswal has written significantly on the political institutions and political philosophy of Bharat prior to colonization, so to speak, saying what was our conception of a state? How is it that we had the concept of a confederacy around the, let's say, in not just ancient Bharat, significantly even in medieval Bharat, so to speak. So these are aspects which I don't think have received rigorous treatment. We discuss most of these issues in silos. I mean, it's more like a wistful discussion where we're basically saying, "Ek zamane mein hum aisa hua karte the." It's not exactly a serious discussion that we're exactly having. So to give this entire issue, hopefully a coherent and comprehensive treatment, I will be addressing it in the second book, which is the first sequel, where I ask myself whether the framers of the Constitution were inspired by Indian philosophy or were they inspired by European philosophy when they decided to set up the modern, let's say, the contemporary Indian state. Okay. So these are questions that I certainly ask. The one thing that I've certainly done in this book, in the current book, is that I have extracted significantly the Constituent Assembly debates surrounding Article 1, which speaks of India, that is Bharat. And the reason why I've done that is to ask myself, why is it that the framers of the Constitution decided to include Bharat in Article 1? Does it have a historical significance? Does it have a civilizational significance? And what are the sources that they drew from to give Bharat, or let's say India, the name Bharat? Okay. And why is it that we did not have only India or only Bharat? Why do we have India, that is Bharat? These are aspects that I've addressed in the current book. And I've also, let's say, extracted significant portions of the objectives resolution of the Constituent Assembly, which specifically refers to this country as an ancient land. Therefore, when someone makes the statement that Bharat had no existence of its own or identity of its own before August 15, 1947, or before the 26th of January, 1950, how ahistoric and unconstitutional that argument is something that I've tried to meet in this book itself, to say that the framers of the Constitution were very clearly aware that Bharat is the successor state to the Indic civilization. And there is no running away from this, that the framers of the Constitution were very, very conscious of it. And the Constituent Assembly debates make it very, very clear. The only question that needs to be answered at this stage is whether it is a nation state or a civilization state. If yes, what is its identity? But the fact that it is the successor state to the Indic civilization is certainly beyond any reasonable doubt. It is fairly established. Now, just because you happen to be the successor state to a civilization, again, that doesn't make you a civilization state, because you need to look at the policy, you need to look at the structure. Those are issues which I will address. But if someone makes the statement that India and Bharat have no relationship at all, and that India is a synthetic product of, let's say, colonization, and that the white man was doing us a favor by stitching us together as a single nation, I would say that position is uninformed and certainly arrogant.
Thank you, sir, for the detailed and the lucid answer to the question. Now, next question is by Manas. He says that the discussion of impression of coloniality on not only the ideas and ideals, but also on the standard with which these ideals are put to test, then how can one lay the objective foundation for a universal framework of standard themselves to test both Western and Indic ideas and ideals? It seems to be a kind of paradox. Right. So he basically talks about the impressions of coloniality.
Right. So who's the gentleman who asked this question, please?
Manas.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. And the good part is I've addressed this question significantly in the book, which is to say that I am not for a moment saying that there shouldn't be any discussion on universal values or on certain objective benchmarks or standards. I certainly agree that on certain aspects, you must have some objective standards. Otherwise, every society can go back to the Stone Age and practice all sorts of things. Because going by that, What stops somebody from saying that let's bring back untouchability as far as Bharat is concerned, because Europeans don't understand the reason for untouchability, therefore we should again have untouchability. So that is not the argument that I'm trying to make. Second, let me also clarify. The idea is not to bring back the past, because that's not possible. And the idea is to basically ask, are there certain aspects of the past which are of value, which can be used in the present for law and policy making? And should we constantly be looking at our past through the Western lens as opposed to looking at our own past through our lens? That's the central question. But coming to the question that this gentleman has put, the one thing that I very clearly said is that those values which are treated and assumed to be universal today are not universal simply because they have been artificially imposed and universalized. And strictly speaking, when a universal value is sought to be formulated or framed, at the very least, there must be more than one participant on the table who basically contributes to that particular idea. If the West formulates a principle and chooses to call it universal and imposes it on everyone, that doesn't make it a universal value. So what I've clearly said is that in the formulation of objective universal benchmarks and yardsticks when it comes to ethics or everything else under the sun, at the very least, we as a civilization must have a seat at the table where we are in a position to put forth our point of view. From equality to rationality to neutrality to the formation of the state to gender rights to human rights to nature and religion and language policy, everything. If someone sitting in Europe or in, let's say, United States or let's say the West, so to speak, decides for the rest of the world, how on earth would you call it universal? So let's look at it this way. When it comes to Bharat, we constantly make the statement, Delhi Bharat nahi hai, Bharat Delhi nahi hai. That you're not supposed to formulate the policy for the rest of the country, assuming that the rest of the country is like Delhi. If that is your position with respect to formulation of policy within the country itself, how can we accept formulation of universal values by one particular country or one particular race or one particular society, which really has no understanding of society, and most importantly, looks at your society as an inferior, barbaric, savage society, which needs to be educated, reformed, and civilized? If that is the tendency, that means fundamentally your position has zero respect. Your existence has zero respect. You're seen as a barbarian who needs to be constantly reformed out of its identity. So your existence itself is seen as an abomination or a deformity, so to speak, as a blot on the face of the earth, which needs to be rectified through the civilizing lens and the tendency of the colonizer. That is the precise issue. So the issue is not to say that anything and everything can be justified on the basis of individuality, indigeneity. No, that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm clearly striking a distinction between 2 points. Subjectivity of a culture and the right of subjectivity of a culture is one point. Moral relativism is another point. Moral relativism effectively takes the position, sab chalta hai, sab kuch justify kiya ja sakta hai on the basis of individual experience. That is not the position that I have taken. I am saying subjectivity simply means एक आदमी कहीं पे बैठ के बाकियों के लिए डिसाइड नहीं करेगा कि हमारे लिए अच्छा क्या है, बुरा क्या है. एक कल्चर डिसाइड नहीं करेगा. एट द वेरी लीस्ट हमसे बातचीत करनी चाहिए और इस चिंतन और मंथन के प्रोसेस में हमें इंक्लूड किया जाना चाहिए. तब तक यूनिवर्सल वैल्यूज फैशन नहीं किए जा सकते हैं एंड उन वैल्यूज को यूनिवर्सल नहीं माना जा सकता है. ओके, दैट्स द बेसिक पोजीशन दैट आई हैव टेकन. आई होप आई हैव आंसर्ड दिस क्वेश्चन. नेक्स्ट प्लीज.
Yes, sir. Sir, in this spirit, I think the Bandung conference and the Bandung spirit can solve the purpose. Next question is from Shravani.
Yeah.
She has said that in your book, you have said that a state which precedes our civilization is not the same as civilizational state.
Right.
What will be the characteristics and what will define a civilizational state? Does nation become a civilizational state with the help of its legislature, executive, and judiciary? Can a third world country develop and decolonialize at the same time?
Right. In fact, it is my belief that development is not possible without mental independence. And one of the things that I very clearly say is that development and civilizational decolonization go hand in hand. And there's a good reason for it. Why? Because if you believe that the only model for development is the Western model, then you have surrendered your ability to ideate with respect to development at the feet of the colonizer or the Westerner, his successor, so to speak. I refuse to believe, because it defies common sense and logic, to say that there is only one model of development that is possible. And also understand this, that when even the West itself is rethinking its own models of development, given the impact it has had on nature significantly, how can we proceed on the basis that there is only one model? आप जिसको फॉलो करना चाहते हैं वो खुद अपनी करवट बदल रहा है. He himself is changing his direction. And you now want to say that there is only one model of development. When the person who you follow himself is changing paths and changing direction, he himself is admitting that there is no one single model. Most importantly, let's take a local example. Can the model of infrastructure development which is applied to Delhi also be extended to Uttarakhand? No, you can't. Simply because ecology plays a huge role, culture plays a huge role. You can have 6-lane highways and 8-lane highways in Delhi, but if you try and do that in a place like Uttarakhand, you will be devastating and destroying nature altogether. So similarly, when you speak of, let's say, development, one of the things that I've addressed specifically in the book is that colonization has had the effect of uniformizing, so to speak, notions of development across the world, which is to say there is only one benchmark or yardstick on the basis of which we will judge development, literacy, everything under the sun. Without revealing too much from the book itself, because I would want people to read it, I have also very clearly said that you will always suffer from lack of self-confidence as a culture, as long as you believe that development and culture or civilization are two different baskets which have nothing to do with each other. Development affects culture and culture affects development. And please also remember one thing for a fact, that you were not a poor country to which these people were coming to. They came to you precisely because you had something to offer. Okay, so to assume that until they came we had no idea of wealth creation is something that is fundamentally ahistoric, because literature clearly tells us that colonized nations provided the material and the engine needed for the Industrial Revolution in England and other places. So in fact, there is a fantastic scholar by the name Arturo Escobar, whose work on development I have actually cited, where he points out the irony that the colonizer who comes to colonize societies loots them and then leaves, decides to call us third world countries and donor and recipient countries. And now he's giving you donor aid, which is to effectively say the thief is giving back a portion of the stolen goods to the person who actually owns that particular goods. Okay, so when you use third world as a reference for Bharat, you are effectively subscribing to their version of who we are, without actually asking, how did we reach where we are without the contribution of these geniuses who contributed to the loot and plunder of this country? Okay, so one of the things that I very clearly say is that in most instances, only those societies which have had a sense of their own self and which have managed to, at the very least, fuse their native identity with modernity, so to speak, are the ones which have been able to come out with a sustained model of development, and who have also managed to retain what I would call pride in their own culture and in their own consciousness. Everybody else has actually behaved like a mental slave who's only created a bubble. Therefore, if you look at innovation, if you look at the realm of culture, if you look at the realm of art, if you look at the realm of literature, each of these realms requires original thinking. And your thinking cannot be original as long as you're buried under layers of civilization, of colonial consciousness. But let me go a step further and answer the unasked part of your question, which is, you will never be able to regain your past fully. That's not going to happen. Okay. And in that sense, you may be a perpetual victim or a victim for eternity, but I am not asking us to celebrate and value in this victimhood for eternity. My position in my book is not to say, let us constantly gripe and whine about the fact that hum lut gaye, barbaad ho gaye. Okay. I am merely saying, recognize that your current discussions on every issue, from caste to religion to civilization to identity to heritage, are significantly informed by colonial consciousness. So try and remove that particular layer and then have these discussions, because two things will happen. You will be looking at a less distorted and less colonialized version of history. Therefore, it informs your discussions better. Second, it is extremely important to have a certain degree of pride in your culture. And when someone says cultural pride has got nothing to do with material development, he or she has not understood how development or psychology of development actually works. No country has been able to develop materially without having a certain sense of national pride. Some countries, in fact, invent histories to create national pride. I am not asking for invention of history. I'm merely asking for rediscovery of history and understanding a less distorted version of history. So please do not underestimate the value of history in creating a certain sense of originality, which will certainly contribute to development. These questions have been very specifically addressed both in sections 1 and 2. So I would request Shravani to read both these sections in greater detail, because I've explained the relationship between ontology, epistemology, theology, culture, and development. And I've very clearly said that each time you look at development as a purely mercantile inquiry, then you fail to understand that all development starts from pride in self and confidence in self. Unless and until that is there, it's impossible for you to hope to reach the high table of global powers. Whether you reach the table or not, whether you occupy that particular seat or not, the simple point is this: money and culture are not in silos. They are not in walled gardens. Both go hand in hand. The other thing that I've specifically addressed is that if your development model follows the Western model completely, it is going to distort your own notions and respect for nature. Bharat has a very clear position with respect to centrality of nature, both to its faith systems, its way of life, its social customs, and its development. Both. Okay. Therefore, a country which is actually not exactly flush with a lot of water, we have water shortage in this country, and ecological balance is fragile in several parts of the country. How do you hope to discuss development without actually taking nature into account? That is one of the things that I try and address. I also make a very clear caveat in the book saying, I am not someone who's against wealth creation. I'm certainly not a communist or a socialist by any yardstick. 3, I also make the very clear statement that I'm not a Luddite. And if someone calls me a tree hugger, so be it, I don't have a problem. I think we need more tree huggers at this particular point of time. But all I'm saying is, you need to be able to take a very balanced approach with respect to nature and development. Because if everybody wants to have everything, then it is a race to the bottom, because I don't think we have enough resources to satisfy everybody's needs. Imagine if the yardstick for what constitutes a human development index is uniform, and we expect the entire society to rise up at that particular standard, somebody is going to pay the price for it. And the first entity that's going to pay the price for it happens to be nature. Nature will be the first casualty at the altar of development if it's supposed to be uniform.
Right. So another question is from Abhijit. He says that he has read in your book that Indian judicial system needs to draw its morality from its Dharma. Now we know Dharma addresses the spheres of legislature, executive, and judiciary, and is not only limited to religion. How do you believe Dharma can serve as a source of inspiration for Indian judiciary?
Can you repeat the first part of the question, please? Just the first part.
He says that it is written in your book that Indian judicial system needs to draw its morality from Dharma.
Right.
So he wants to know, how do you believe that Dharma can serve as a source of inspiration for the Indian judiciary?
So to clarify, what I have tried to hint at in the book is that the concept of public morality in every jurisdiction is significantly drawn from its own civilizational or cultural ethos. Okay. And at the very least, the framers of the constitution have hinted, at least some of the framers have hinted at the fact that Dharma happens to be the reservoir of public morality as far as Bharat is concerned. In fact, they have gone to the extent of saying it's Dharma which binds the civilization as one unit, as one civilization or one social unit, notwithstanding the diversity that abounds in this particular place. So when I say Dharma should influence law and public morality, so to speak, the point I'm trying to make is that again, coming back to development, nature plays a huge role in formulation of dharmic principles. That's one. Second, your treatment of, let's say, faith systems, your treatment of places of civilizational importance such as temples, whether the state is consistent with Dharma when it chooses to occupy the temples of worship of one particular community or the places of worship of one particular community. whether the state is acting in accordance with Dharma when it chooses to utilize the wealth of one particular community, which is the community's private property, for public purposes. Whether the state is consistent with Dharma when it believes that, let's say, it must treat its minorities the same way a European nation does. When in Bharat, everybody is a minority and everybody is a majority, for the simple reason that even within the Hindu society, for all practical purposes, given the sheer diversity of sampradayas and sheer diversity of denominations, so to speak, and I've clearly said the denomination and sampradaya are not the same. You can't really equate the two. But since I don't have another translatable, so to speak, for sampradaya in English, I'll use the word denomination. Given that religious denominations abound within the Hindu system itself, it's impossible to, in fact, treat this religion as one majority religion. In fact, it is an agglomeration of minorities. Okay, it's an agglomeration of multiple minorities, so to speak. So therefore, when you treat Dharma as the touchstone on the anvils of which you address religion, you address foreign policy, you address your external transactions, you address development, obviously it's bound to have a bearing. Let's take a look at language itself. Why should I be forced to learn in English as a medium of instruction? Most people are bound to say, because India has too many languages, then how do we hope to have a single language policy? In this particular regard, I think we must draw inspiration from the fact, as I said before, that you don't compare India with any particular country in Europe, but you compare it with Europe itself. And if Europe does not have one single language on the basis of which it conducts its commercial transactions or legal transactions, why on earth are we limiting ourselves to only one particular transaction? So assuming for a moment that I, as a citizen of this country, who perhaps is educated in Tamil medium or Malayalam medium, or let's say or Hindi medium, or any other language for that matter, which is not English, if I wish to practice before the Supreme Court in a language which is not English, if the Supreme Court of Bharat subscribes to only English language policy, so to speak, is that not a reflection of colonial consciousness? Is it not a reflection of the fact that the topmost constitutional court of the country is much more comfortable transacting in an alien language as opposed to an Indian language itself? This would be the direct ramification or manifestation of dharmic policy making in the realm of law and language. Okay. Second, if you wish to have, let's say, discussions with respect to replacement of principles of common law with indigenous legal jurisprudence, several judgments exist from English courts which clearly say common law traces its origins to the revealed religion, which is Christianity. So I am being asked to subscribe to values of common law, which has got nothing to do with the faiths of this particular land and which has not originated in this country. Why can't I trace principles of common law, or let's say tort law, from those schools of thought which have emanated from this land and which have originated in this particular country? The interesting part is, Indian legal jurisprudence is better read in London and other places than in Bharat itself. A school of Asian studies, or let's say an LSE or a Queen's Mary University of London or any of these institutions, seem to be much more interested and aware of, let's say, Indic schools of jurisprudence and philosophy than our own students. So when I ask for dharmic principles in law and policy making, it starts with legal education. Unfortunately, when we speak of, let's say, Indian schools of philosophy in legal education contemporarily, it is limited primarily in the realm of succession. We talk of Vitakshara, Dayabhaga, and beyond that, we don't know much about Indian schools of philosophy. The 6 darshanas, the Shad darshanas find no reference whatsoever, or at least it's minimal reference. When you discuss jurisprudence, you seem to be much more comfortable talking about Richard Posner or a Kant or others, so to speak, or a Hegel, or let's say a Kelsenian Grantnorm. But where is the Indian philosophy in this discussion when you speak of jurisprudence? If the fount of law, which is jurisprudence, is completely colonized in nature, where is the question of us having any indigenous thought or original thought in the first place? And the impression that it gives to students when you actually start with Western philosophy and end with Western philosophy in the realm of jurisprudence is that Bharat has nothing to contribute in this particular regard, and the entire concept of law, rule of law, morality, public morality, ethics, and everything comes from abroad. That is the impression that it creates. Then when you speak of Mimamsa principles, or when you speak of Nyaya principles or Vaiseshika principles, you are scoffed at because you have zero exposure to that. I've given this example in different places previously, that there used to be a time when practitioners before the Madras High Court were expected to be trained in Mimamsa principles before they took up practice in that court. That practice is dead today. Nobody reads Mimamsa principles. Mimamsa principles are one of the finest set of, let's say, argumentative principles that have ever been created. And there is much more scholarship and commentary around that subject outside this country once more. So the funny part is, Bharat provides the, let's say, the reservoir of primary data and material for everybody else to talk about us, but Bharat itself doesn't want to create any theory or conceptual frameworks based on its own thought and process. That is the sad situation. So when you ask for application of Dharma in our law and policy making, let's start with legal education. That will automatically have an impact on your ability to think of legal innovation when a problem is presented to you. Because today, the first thing that happens when you have a situation is you ask yourself, England ne kya kiya, Australia ne kya kiya, Europe ne kya kiya, America ne kya kiya. Let's look at the law commission reports of those countries. Let's look at the, let's say, the cogitation in those countries. There is no attempt whatsoever to draw from indigenous thought. So therefore, it starts with education and then leads to policy making. Because the current generation is effectively going to be the policymaker of the future. Next, please.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir, for highlighting the Mimamsa rules of interpretation and their value. And also that history gives us beautiful possibilities to explore. Next question is from Parul. She says that your work reflects upon the origins of secularism, tolerance, and humanism.
Right.
In light of this, you can reflect upon the significance of the 42nd Amendment and the position of Bharat before and after it. What were the origins of your perspective? And to add, sir, I would also ask you to reflect upon the Constitutional Assembly debates relating to this.
Right. So, pardon me for giving you a slightly truncated response to this question. The better part of the answer to this question will come in the sequel, and I don't want to reveal that yet because the research is still underway and quite a few aspects are still underway. But let me address this partially. What I have done, citing the work of, let's say, stalwarts and other scholars such as J. Ruba, S.N. Balagangadhara, and scholars from other parts of the world, is to explain that the way we understand secularism in this country is so completely divorced from its origins and history that it's like a separate creature and a khichdi that we have created in this country. Okay. Separation of the church from the state simply means that the state shall not interfere with the affairs of religion because the affairs of religion are the exclusive preserve of the church. That's the actual reason why the separation of the church from the state was introduced. So that state does not interfere with religion because it is formulated on the biblical position that matters of spirituality must remain in the realm of the church and church must have complete control over it. And the state shall have control over secular aspects, which is to say non-religious aspects. But most importantly, the state which respects the distinction between the church and the state is fundamentally a Christian state because it is traceable to two very specific biblical quotes, which is to say there are two kingdoms according to Christian theological belief. One is the kingdom of God and the other is the kingdom of earth. So when it comes to kingdom of God, it is seen as the realm of spirituality and religion. When it comes to the kingdom of earth, it is seen as the secular realm or the temporal realm. So I'm basically saying that when you read the history of the Reformation, when you read the history of the Treaty of Westphalia, it is impossible to come to the conclusion that separation of the church from the state translates to a state without any religious identity. Every European state has a very clear religious identity. So for instance, I've very clearly mentioned that 26 archbishops are given the pride of place in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. And also that they have a very, the Anglican Church is the head church of that particular country. And the monarch is seen as the titular head of the particular church. This applies to Netherlands. This applies to Sweden. This applies to Norway. This applies to every European country. So in this country, we are being told a secular country means a country which has no religious identity. I mean, this is as stupid as it gets, and it is as ahistoric as it gets. This is completely factually incorrect, historically incorrect, and logically also incorrect. So therefore, my entire position has been, if you want us to be a secular country, fantastic. Then European countries are Christian secular, we will be Hindu secular. That is the position that I'm basically making. To say that please understand that secularism does not mean that a country does not have a religious identity. It means that the state apparatus shall not interfere with aspects of religion because aspects of religion are completely within the control of the church. In this country, the state and the judiciary, the executive and the legislature constantly interfere with religious places, religious institutions, and specifically the institutions of only one particular community. So this is not secular by any yardstick, neither by the French yardstick or the American yardstick or the non-French European yardstick. Therefore, what we understand of secularism in this country, which we keep talking of as some kind of a religious virtue or a great virtue, is it has no basis in history. So in this section, and I would request students of law to read this section and the history of secularism, which I've captured in some detail in the book, along with primary sources, to understand that what nonsense we mouth in the name of secularism in this country. It is academically rubbish. And any person who simply spouts the values of secularism, I would ask him, do you even know what you're talking about? So one of the things that I've tried to do is to say, before you celebrate a value and keep it on your head and dance till the, let's say, the cows come home until the eternity of time, please understand the origins of it. Please understand the history of it. Unfortunately, today, students of law are perhaps the poorest students of history and the worst students of history. They have zero understanding as far as the historical context of a legal development is concerned. They simply latch onto the buzzwords. They simply latch onto the end results, but not to everything that led to that particular outcome. So the idea is to say, when you speak of the Constitution and when you speak of constitutional values, at the very least, have some humility to go through history before you simply treat this document as a religious document. It is not a religious document. The Constitution, which has been subjected to 104 amendments and is bound to be subjected to another hundreds of amendments in the near future or perhaps in our living future, cannot be treated as a religious document under any circumstances and should not be treated as an immutable document in all respects. So a document which is socio-political and legal and which is subject to several political machinations, as clearly demonstrated by the 42nd Amendment under Indira Gandhi, which clearly shows that it is subject to the vagaries of power. It is subject to the whim and fancy of the top person. How can you call this as a document which is sacrosanct in nature? I'm not saying disrespect the Constitution. I'm not saying constitutionalism has no value. I'm not making any of these statements. I'm saying it must be respected. You must live by the Constitution as long as you're in a country which is a constitutional form of democracy. All that is accepted. But please don't think of this as a document which has been sent from the heavens by, let's say, Angel Gabriel. No, that has not happened. This is not a revealed document. It has not come from the heavens. It is not a biblical document under any yardstick. Okay. So therefore, give it the respect of a practical document and give it the respect of a document which helps you govern your country. Beyond that, don't conflate and confuse your identity with that particular document. Your civilization and your culture have existed before the concept of a constitution ever arose on the horizon in the world, and will continue to survive and exist even after this concept may or may not survive. Because 500 years, according to me, is nothing in, let's say, in the cycle of history. It's a blip, it's a milestone, or it's not even a milestone. According to me, it's a pit stop. It's some 500 years in let's say human history, recorded human history, is not too much of a huge period. Because the one thing that I very clearly said in the book is 50 years ago, the position of the West was different, and now it is different. And you're able to see that the West is not as strong as it used to be 50 years ago. And the center of power, or the notional center of power gravity, so to speak, is gradually moving away from the West and moving towards the East. If this is something that can happen in a span of 50 years, who knows what will happen in the next 10 years or 50 years? We have no idea. So to assume that all the values that Europe has bestowed us are meant to be treated as values for eternity and universal in nature is sheer stupidity, and no student of civilizational studies or history will buy this nonsense. It's only students of law who are more than happy to buy this nonsense. That's the surprising part. Students of law are expected to be much more historically aware, because you can never understand a legal provision without reference to context. That is what even your, let's say, your principles of interpretation tell you, that if there is some kind of ambiguity when you read a legal provision, so to speak, please refer to history. So clearly, your own principles of interpretation require you to give some respect to history. But somehow when we read the document, which is the Constitution itself, we completely forget history and the setting of that particular document, the cultural setting of that particular document and the civilizational setting of that particular document. So the entire message to at least law students, when they read this book, is that open your minds one bit and let go of your preconceived notions of what you think of secularism, humanism, and all that, and try and understand history first without letting your preconceived notions come in the way of your understanding of the subject. Okay, so that's the one thing that I've done. The good news, according to me, is that this book is not exclusively aimed at law students. Law students are only 30%, or let's say practitioners of law are only 30% of the audience that I'm going after. But I certainly want law students to read this, because I don't think this discussion happens in law schools. Your curriculum doesn't provide you the freedom to discuss all of this. At the very least, dare I say this, the atmosphere in law schools is not conducive for such a discussion, because it is rife with political incorrectness, and you'll be gagged and stifled in one way or the other. So I'm giving you an opportunity to have these discussions outside your syllabus. It's extracurricular, but it'll inform your curriculum even better. So please read it. At the very least, even if you don't think my views have any value, I have cited the views of scholars on the basis of which I've come out with my opinions. So read those primary references. It'll help you immensely and significantly. I'll take one last question, if at all.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for the detailed answer. I would like to add that as a student of comparative constitutional law, I would say that if you read Bangladeshi constitution, you would find that the constitution says that it is a secular country. At the same time, it says that the religion of the state is Islam.
Correct.
So that you actually, signifies your argument of Hindu secular.
Right.
So next question is from Nidhi. She says that you have placed your reliance on the scholars from Latin America,
right,
and other places where native culture has diminished completely.
Right.
And then how is the scholarship so vibrant in these nations,
right,
as compared to India, which holds some of its civilizational identity?
Right.
And where did we go wrong?
Such a fantastic question. I'm so grateful for this question, because I've addressed this again. I'm so happy that my book is addressing the very questions that students are asking me. Please read my book. I urge you to read it, because I've clearly said that everyone and anyone who has sought to come out with scholarship similar to Latin American scholarship in Bharat has been effectively branded a right-winger, has been branded a xenophobe, has been branded an anti-minority majoritarian, has been called a fascist. Scholars have been called fascists. You must remember that scholars like R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar, and Radhakumud Mukherjee, their books were effectively marginalized immediately under the Nehru dispensation. And these people were treated as outcasts, so to speak, pardon me for using that language, because the post-colonial school and the Marxist school did not want students to become aware of these versions of history, or at least these facts. See, today we are being told, in the backdrop of the discussion happening around the Indian Council for Historical Research, that you shouldn't communalize history, you shouldn't do this and that. The funny part is, in India, history has been completely secularized, which is to say, nothing that is uncomfortable shall ever be revealed to students. We will never discuss uncomfortable aspects of history in the interest of maintaining peace. How are we a peaceful country? We are not a peaceful country. We have not been a peaceful country for the last 70 years. Social tensions have constantly existed. So what is this peace at the interest of whom we are sacrificing the truth? So if you look at the opening lines of the book, I quote a specific shloka, or let's say a specific, stanza from the Rig Veda, where I say why truth is more important than everything else. Peace which is built on the basis of a lie will never stand. And today, whatever we call as social peace and harmony is built on a lie, which has been sustainedly fed successive generations through history departments, through your textbooks. Therefore, one of the things that I strongly believe is that history departments must have greater diversity of thought. Unfortunately, history and legal departments across the country are dominated only by one voice or one ideology, making it difficult for anybody else to have any kind of access to the thought space and mind space of people. On the one hand, these people say that freedom of thought and speech and diversity is something that they celebrate, but there is zero diversity in thought, speech, and let's say ideation, so to speak. I think history departments and legal departments in this country follow the Indian traffic rules. Keep left. If you're not left, you don't get to survive. So therefore, the point I'm trying to make is that your question is extremely pertinent. Do not assume that history is free of politics. The politics of history and the politics of academia is worse than national politics. because it does serious injustice to the future. It prevents successive generations from understanding their past and understand the lessons from the past. It constantly pushes you into falling asleep, saying, you keep sleeping, don't worry about any of these. It gives you a false sense of comfort. And when reality hits you, you're not ready to deal with it because you have not been told that what you're seeing in the present has already happened in the past. And how your ancestors dealt with this particular situation, how they survived in that particular situation is something that you're not being told. So the reason that I specifically, I also explain which are the authors who have been systematically marginalized by the system. So the blunt answer to your question is that the Nehruvian post-colonial Marxist dispensation must be held single-handedly responsible for stifling voices, for killing diversity in academic thought, for killing diversity in academic research, and for distorting history and for brushing several aspects of history under the carpet. That is the only direct answer that I think I should give. I don't want to beat around the bush on this particular aspect. This is the truth. Anybody who says is otherwise, let them tell us why are other aspects of history not being revealed to students? Why are we being told that there is only one set of, let's say, preferred authors that we should be reading? What about the other side? We are more than happy to discuss, let's say, rival opinions in such a contentious issue such as Article 370 or CAA. But when it comes to the history of this country, only one version works. How is that even permissible? So one of the things that I try and do through this book is to trigger a serious conversation in this regard, saying, why am I being given only one version of history? Why am I not being given other facts so that I can form my own views? Let students apply their own brains. Let students apply their own independent free agency. But they should be given access to resources. They must be given access to facts. I think the best thing that could have happened to this generation is the internet. Because the internet is killing everything that the students are being fed through textbooks. Okay? Because internet is giving access to primary resources. From archive.org to several resources, open resources, you're getting primary material that's making you ask questions like, what on earth have I been taught in schools? What kind of nonsense have I been fed in schools through, let's say, the mainstream education? So therefore, the answer to your question is this is a deliberate strategy to prevent you. It's a deliberate, let's say, systematic attempt and a successful one at that, which has prevented you from accessing other points of view with respect to history, which is exactly why a decolonial approach to history is a civilizational imperative. It's an existential imperative as far as Bharat is concerned, because whatever has happened in the past continues to happen in several parts of the several parts of the country, and we are being told don't look at it through the lens of religion. Now we are even being told that partition of this country has got nothing to do with religion. I mean, I don't understand how is this nonsense being fed. So I have specifically addressed even the roots of partition in certain parts of the book, where I deal with the concept of Middle Eastern coloniality, saying Bharat is buried under two layers of alien colonialities. One is Middle Eastern coloniality and the other is European coloniality. And I explain the similarities as well as the differences between both forms of thinking and thought control. So I urge young students, please read this. You criticize the book. You're welcome to say that this particular book arrives at wrong conclusions. I don't have a problem. But do so after looking at the facts that I present in the book. Because the one thing that I've done very clearly is that I have extracted legislative debates from the British Parliament word for word to explain how their intention was to convert this country into a Christian country and how they decided to use the constitution as a mechanism for large-scale conversion and proselytization of the country. Read it. I have given their own language so that nobody accuses me of confirmation bias or for putting words in their mouth. This is coming directly from the horse's mouth. The last 4 chapters of the book, 8, 9, 10, and 11, specifically deal with the period from the 31st of December 1600 to 1919-1920. Why 31st of December 1600? Because that was the date on which the charter was issued to the London company known as the British East India Company, so that it can establish trade relations with Bharat. Most people assume that the colonizers' enterprise in Bharat was a commercial enterprise. No, it was a civilizing Christian enterprise meant to convert us. Read it. Now, imagine every part of the world that the colonizer goes to has become Christian. Is it a matter of coincidence? Australia is Christian, New Zealand is Christian, Africa is Christian, North America is Christian, Latin America is Christian, Caribbean is Christian. Somehow India is not Christian, and we are being told that the credit must go to the colonizer. It's almost as if we are being told भारत की पुण्य भूमि पे पैर रखते ही इसका हृदय परिवर्तन हो गया. ऐसे कैसे हो जाता है भाई? I don't understand. How does it even work? This defies logic and this defies history. He has maintained a consistent, let's say, intention to convert indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, but भारत में आते ही इनका हृदय परिवर्तन हो जाता है. क्या इनका घर वापसी हो गया था? ये कैसे हो जाता है भाई? I don't understand. So please read it. These are uncomfortable aspects of history, and you're bound to encounter these discussions in your law schools, in your office spaces, and in your private spaces. So this book is effectively an ammunition in your hand to understand history. Or at the very least, it gives you a very clear conceptual framework to make sense of all this noise.
Thank you, sir. On that note, let's bring this wonderful session to an end. We really appreciate the time you took out for Samvad. We are grateful for your speech and also for your thoughts and experiences you shared with us. It was a wonderful opportunity to interact with you as such a stalwart scholar who has such in-depth knowledge on vital civilizational issues. Best wishes for your book. We will also be eagerly waiting for the next 2 books of this series. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And I'm grateful to you, the organizers, as well as the students, for giving me a patient hearing. I hope that the book adds value to what you already know. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you, sir.